Okay, this is a lecture about fundamentals of muscle. So we're taking the introductory information that we covered in lecture 4 and kind of taking it a step further and applying it to muscle contraction and muscle function. So I've entitled this lecture 4B, and again, it's just a continuation of information related to muscle function. So skeletal muscle, again, is where we're going to focus in this particular lecture. And again, we're going to apply some of the principles of muscle contraction to their functions and how the structure of particular skeletal muscles in terms of gross anatomy might affect their function. So skeletal muscle is responsible for movement of the body and all of its joints. Muscles can provide us with protection. So if you think about the muscles that cover your abdominal area, again, there's no bones that are protecting our internal organs in that particular area, but we do have about 3 layers of muscle that surrounds that abdominal area, and again, that will help us with some level of protection for that area. Muscles also contribute to our posture. So again, we made mention in the previous lecture about the stabilizer muscles that we have that are going to allow us to maintain an erect posture. And again, these particular muscles are going to be high in endurance because they're contracting almost all the time that we're in a seated or upright position. Muscles are also going to provide us, again, with that major portion of body heat. And again, these are a few of the functions that we talked about previously in lecture 4. We also have something called an aggregate muscle action. And this is when muscles work as a team opposed to individually to achieve a given muscle action, or to achieve a given joint action, we could say. So again, an aggregate muscle action is when muscles work as a team as opposed to independently to achieve a given joint action. So it's basically when we have a group of muscles that work together to achieve a common goal. You can think about this in terms of several groups of muscles that you have within your body. One great example of an aggregate muscle group would be the quadriceps. So there are actually 4 separate muscles involved, and all 4 muscles are going to play an important role for us in terms of completing knee extension. And again, we'll talk in more detail about the different aggregate muscle groups that we have, but that's one example. Another example of aggregate muscle action, if you think about elbow flexion, we think commonly of the biceps brachii as the major mover for that particular action. 2 other muscles that would also be involved would be the brachialis and brachioradialis. And again, all 3 muscles work together as an aggregate muscle group in order to complete that particular action. So in terms of some muscle nomenclature, muscles can be named by one or more distinctive characteristic. So sometimes by their visual appearance. Let me see if I can think of an example. So deltoid, for example. Delta means triangle, and supposedly the deltoid muscle is triangular in appearance, so visual appearance. Also, let's see, anatomical location can give us some information about where the muscle is. So for example, biceps brachii, the brachii area or brachialis area is in your arm. So we know that that muscle is located somewhere within the arm. Another example, biceps femoris. We know our femur is the thigh bone, we could say. So we know that biceps femoris is going to have some sort of action related to the femur itself. Bones can also be named based on their function. So for example, some of the muscles in your wrist or that have an effect on your wrist tell you what their actions are. So pronator teres is one example, and its job is to cause pronation of the wrist. Extensor digiti minimi. So again, that kind of fits into 2 categories. It tells us that it's an extensor, and that's its function. Digiti minimi is the, I guess, anatomical term for your pinky. So it also tells us your anatomical location. So, a lot of muscles can be named based on one of these three factors or on, some more than one of these three factors. Again, I've got a couple of different examples listed down below. Visual appearance, so again, based on shape. So like we said, deltoid is supposedly triangular shaped, and delta means triangle. Rhomboid, so that's kind of like a shape with four sides, and our rhomboid muscle is kind of a shape with four sides. Also can be based on size itself. So gluteus maximus is a large muscle. Maximus would be large, where teres minor is a small muscle. Minor would mean small. Number of divisions. So triceps brachii. So tri means three, and our tricep itself has three different heads or three different attachments, and then they all merge together to form a common insertion point. Can also be named based on the direction of the fibers. So external abdominal obliques, the fiber arrangement within this particular muscle group is going to be an oblique manner or arranged obliquely. Also based on points of attachment, so coracobrachialis is attached to the coracoid process of the scapula, and brachialis again means arm, so it has its action somewhere on the arm. And then also could be based on action. So erector spinae, guess what? It keeps the spine erect in nature. So again, the muscle tells you exactly what the function is. So in terms of shape of muscles and fiber arrangement, again, this can be one way in which we name the muscle. The shape and arrangement of muscle fibers can also play a role in terms of exertion of force and the range through which it can exert its force. So factors that are important for us to consider would be the diameter of the muscle, the total length of the muscle, and then the arrangement of the fibers. All right, so in terms of diameter, the larger the diameter of the muscle, the greater the force they can produce. This makes sense if you think about, basically we're saying the larger your muscle is, the stronger it is. And that makes sense for us. That's one of the reasons why we lift weights, is to hopefully cause our muscles to become larger, and therefore we would become stronger in nature. Total length, the longer the muscle is, the greater the range of motion of that particular muscle action. And then in terms of its fiber arrangement, and we've got some pictures coming up to better explain what this means, but parallel muscles generally have a large range of motion, and pinnate muscles are going to allow us to produce a great amount of force. Again, so here are some examples of those fiber arrangements that we've talked about. And we have three different types of pinnate muscles. They can be unipinnate. Uni means one. So the fibers are kind of oblique in nature. And again, all the muscle fibers on the same side of the tendon and the pinnate muscle, again, is called unipinnate. So A is an example of unipinnate. Bipinnate, bi means two. So bipinnate muscles have a central tendon that runs through the middle of them. So it has fibers that run on either sides of this particular tendon. And again, you can kind of see the separation of those fiber types here in letter B. And then multipinnate has several tendons running through them. And again, now we can see this kind of parallel arrangement in three different sections, basically. So deltoid is an example of a multipinnate muscle. Generally speaking, the unipinnate and bipinnate arrangement are the strongest types of muscles that we can have. So again, if you look at the rectus femoris, this is one of your quadriceps muscles, and it's debatably one of the strongest muscles that we have. I would rank it in the top 5 for sure in terms of a muscle that can create a large amount of force. In terms of parallel muscle fibers, there are a few different options for us. So I got 3 orange X's here through those pennate muscles that we talked about. I couldn't find a good image that just showed the parallel arrangements. So letter D, which I have an X through, is the unipennate. Letter E was the bipennate muscle, and then letter F is the multipennate muscle. But in terms of parallel arrangements, there are really, I guess, 5 different options in terms of these arrangements. So letter A is called a falciform or spindle type muscle. And this is, you've got a muscle belly in the middle, and then it tapers down to form a tendon here. So again, kind of largest in the middle and spindle shaped in nature. Okay. We can also have a flat type of muscle. So this is letter B that we're looking at here. And the flat muscle is usually thin and broad, and it's sheet-like in nature, and it can spread its force over a large area. Letter C, we're looking at radiate muscle, so R-A-D-I-A-T-E, radiate. And this is going to be triangular or fan-shaped in nature. So again, I guess the difference between this and the pinnate muscle fibers is you can see that some of the fibers run straight down and some are coming in this direction, where with the pinnate muscles, they're kind of diagonal in nature. Let's see. So a radiate muscle, triangular or fan-shaped, starts as a broad aponeurosis and converges into one common insertion point. And aponeurosis, the word aponeurosis means apron, actually, but it's just like a big sheet-like amount of muscle you could think of. And the latissimus dorsi is a good example of a radiate muscle. Letter G here, we're looking at a sphincter or circular arrangement. And this type of muscle fiber arrangement surrounds openings and functions to close them upon contraction. So one example of this would be the orbicularis oculi, and that is a muscle that surrounds your eyes and allows you to blink. And again, the circular arrangement can allow us to kind of close that circle when it contracts. The 5th type of parallel arrangement, which is not showed in this image, is a strap-like fibers. And this is long parallel fibers, so the fibers, I guess, are similar to that of the spindle-shaped, with the exception of they don't bulge out at the sides. They're just straight, strap-like, basically. Long parallel fibers. One example of this strap-like arrangement, it would be the sartorius muscle. In terms of muscle terminology, a few different terms we need to be aware of, and again, we will get to apply these once we get to lab starting on Monday. We'll be talking about the action, innervation, origin, insertion of each muscle that we discuss. So the action is obviously what the muscle does, what's the muscle's function. And when we talk about actions, it's important for us to not only say, what type of movement is occurring, but also differentiate and tell us what joint it's occurring at. So hip flexion, for example, could be an action, or knee extension could be an example. And again, like I said, let me emphasize that it's very important for us when we're talking about muscle action to differentiate between what joint it is that you're talking about, because we do have a lot of muscles that are going to cross more than one joint, and they're going to have different actions at different joints. So we can't just say, oh, the action is flexion of the leg, or we can't just say the action is flexion. Okay, is it flexion of the hip? Is it flexion of the knee? So we need to, again, be very specific in terms of what joint it is having its effect on. The origin is the point of attachment that's generally proximal in nature or close to your midline, and this is going to be an immovable type of attachment. And the innervation, again, in a general sense, is going to be more distal and compared to the origin, a lot of times somewhere in your extremities. and this is the movable site of the muscle attachment. But again, both the origin and insertion are points of attachment of the muscle to a bone. Okay. Innervation is tells us which nerve is going to have a level of control over that particular muscle. And we will be focusing on this in a broad sense, but we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of the innervation of each individual muscle. But it will be, important for us to understand the innervations just in a general sense. And again, this is something that we'll focus more on in lab. And a tendon is the fibrous connective tissue that attaches a muscle to a bone, and this is going to occur at the level of the insertion. So in terms of movement differentiation, joint movement again can occur on both sides of the joint actively contracting. And this occurs as a combination of concentric and eccentric contractions. And again, we defined these two terms in our previous lecture. Again, concentric is shortening and eccentric is lengthening. So muscles may be contracting when no movement is occurring, and this would involve isometric contractions. An isometric contraction is when there is no movement at that particular joint. So we're creating a level of force, but the joint movement is not actually changing. So an example of an isometric contraction, a plank is a great example. You are creating an amount of force, and again, you can feel it like in your abdominal or in your core region when you're actually doing the exercise. So you're creating a force, but no movement is actually occurring. Another great example of isometric contraction would be a wall sit. Again, you're creating a large amount of force in your leg muscles, but there's no movement actually occurring. So those are two examples of isometric contractions. In terms of this movement differentiation, again, if one side of the joint is shortening, generally the other side of the joint must be lengthening. Okay, and again, this is something that we'll cover in greater detail in lab, and hopefully this will just give you kind of the background information that we need to kind of apply these principles starting next week. So some of the roles of the muscles that we'll be talking about are agonist, antagonist, stabilizers, and synergists. And I think I've got a slide for each of these so we can kind of define these one at a time. But basically, I'll just give you kind of a rundown here. And like I said, the coming up slides will give you a little more details about these. But the agonist is basically the guy who's doing the work, who is in charge of causing this joint action. An antagonist is someone who does the opposite. So for example, if we wanted to do elbow flexion, the major muscle involved would be the biceps brachii. And that would allow us to have elbow flexion. The opposite action of that would be elbow extension, and that would be done through the antagonist. And the major antagonist of the biceps brachii would be triceps brachii. And generally they're located, the agonist and antagonist are located on opposing sides of a joint. So again, the biceps brachii is on the anterior side of your arm, and the triceps brachii is on the posterior side of your arm. So agonist would be biceps brachii, antagonist, who does the opposite action, would be triceps brachii. A stabilizer muscle helps to keep the joint in place basically while this particular action is occurring. So for example, when you're doing a pull-up, the major muscles that you're using are your back muscles. And the major joint action that we're having is arm or shoulder extension. It also requires a large amount of stabilization of your core muscles. So in order to prevent yourself from like swinging all over the place, you have to have the contraction of your core muscles, and those are going to act as stabilizers. So they're going to help to keep the joint or keep the body in appropriate position while you're completing the activity. A synergist muscle is a helper muscle. So for example, if we were to do, again, if we stick with the example of pull-ups, The major muscle or the agonist muscle for that activity would be latissimus dorsi, and a synergist or a smaller helper muscle basically would be teres major. So teres major is a helper muscle for that particular activity. Okay, an, an agonist, again, when contracting concentrically or having that shortening, this is what causes the joint motion to occur, also known as the primary mover, and the muscle that contributes significantly more to the joint movement than any other agonist. Okay, so this is related generally to muscle fiber arrangement, usually to muscle size. A lot of students ask, how can I figure out which is the primary mover or which is the major mover in this particular activity? Um, because there might be several muscles involved. And a good rule of thumb, I think, for figuring out what the primary mover is to determine what's the largest muscle. And that most likely is going to be the primary mover of the action. The antagonist muscle, again, is the muscle that has the opposite concentric joint action from the agonist. So again, if we want to go back to our example of bicep, the bicep, when it shortens or concentrically contracts, it causes elbow flexion. And the muscle that does the opposite action, when it concentrically contracts, would be triceps brachii. So that's its antagonist. Again, generally located on the opposite side of the joint, and antagonist muscles must be relaxed or lengthening when an agonist muscle is contracting. And again, this makes sense if you think about if they have opposite actions, you need to have one side shortening and one side lengthening in order for joint movement to actually occur. Stabilizers are going to surround a joint and contract to stabilize the area to enable another limb or body segment to exert force and move. Can also contract to resist the specific actions of other muscles. Again, an example of this would be your core muscles while doing a pull-up, and these are going to help to prevent kind of that swinging motion that your body might otherwise enter into. Most muscles of the shoulder girdle act as stabilizers when we have shoulder joint movements, and their job is to help us to stabilize the scapula while the glenohumeral joint moves. Okay, so the scapula, or your shoulder blade, as you might commonly know it, is an interesting bone because it's really just like floating. It doesn't actually connect or have any type of articulation with any other bone. It's just like floating around out there. So it's very important for the muscles that surround this particular bone to serve as very strong stabilizers because there is no connection with this bone to anything else. So this is very important for us in terms of shoulder movements. Okay, synergists are going to assist the action of the agonist, but are not necessarily primary movers for that action. So again, these are helper muscles, and they're generally going to be smaller in size when compared to the primary mover or the agonist. So an example, again, we already gave the example of pull-ups, but let's go back to our example of of your elbow flexion, and we said the major mover was biceps brachii. We might say the brachialis muscle, which also causes elbow flexion, might be considered a synergist because it is generally smaller in size in comparison to your biceps brachii, but it does assist or it does help in causing the same joint action. So how do we determine what the muscle action is? The first thing we can do is look at the bony landmarks that serve as the origin and insertion point for this particular muscle. And we can also look at which joint are they actually crossing. So if we know what joint the muscle is crossing, we already have half of the problem solved. We already know which joint it's going to act upon. Also, it might be important to know the planes of motion through which a joint is capable of moving. So for example, your elbow joint is considered a hinge joint, and so therefore it can only have movement in the sagittal plane of motion. So it's only two options in terms of joint activity or joint movement are going to be flexion and extension. So any muscle that crosses the elbow joint will either cause elbow flexion or elbow extension. So that's pretty easy because there are only two movements available. Joints like your shoulder joint, which can cause movement in all planes of motion, this doesn't really do you much good because there are many different options for you. So it could be flexion, extension, rotation, abduction, adduction, circumduction through any plane of motion. So it's not very helpful for that particular joint, but it can be helpful for joints such as your elbow and your knee. We can also look at the line of pull and arrangement of muscle fibers. So again, the way the fibers are arranged will tell us how are they going to shorten. So they're going to shorten in there basically in that same line that they are arranged. So if we can look at the line of pull and the arrangement of fibers, this can help us to determine what the major joint action is. We can also look at the muscle's relative length and its ability to generate force. And again, this might be related to the arrangement of fibers because, we said that some of the pinnate arrangements were going to produce the strongest types of muscle contractions, whereas a strap-like muscle isn't going to generate a large amount of force. And lastly, we can also look at the position of other joints as well. So for example, the scapula and its movement is highly related to that of the shoulder joint or the glenohumeral joint, and vice versa. The movement of the glenohumeral joint might be very specifically related to the movement of the scapula as well. So what are some of the factors that are going to affect muscle tension development? So first would be the number of muscle fibers recruited. Okay. So again, in lecture 4, we talked about what recruitment means. And if you want to recruit people like in a sports setting, you want to get more people to come join your team. And that's basically what goes on when we recruit muscle fibers. We want to get more muscle fibers or more muscle cells involved in producing a large amount of force. So this has to do with the number of motor units that we have activated. So the more motor units you have activated, the greater the amount of force. Also the size of the motor units itself. So again, we said that a motor unit is equal to one motor neuron and all the cells that it innervates, or all the muscle fibers that it is in charge of. So a large motor unit would be capable of producing a large amount of force, whereas a small motor unit isn't going to produce a large amount of force. It's going to be more important for some of our fine motor skills. Also, the types of muscle fibers that you're recruiting or that you're activating will be important for us. If we're recruiting fast twitch fibers, this will allow us to produce a large amount of force relatively quickly, whereas if we recruit slow twitch muscle fibers or muscle motor units, then we are not going to be able to produce a large amount of force, but we're going to have a large amount of endurance with whatever that particular activity is. We can also look at the optimal length of the muscle fibers, and this has to do with their position in relation to the actual joint itself. So here we're looking at the length tension relationship. And for those of you that are going to be taking the second half of this class, we'll actually get to test our length tension relationship next semester in lab. And basically what this shows you here is that we have a maximum amount of force that can be produced when the length has a maximum amount of overlap. So if you stretch out your muscle really far, it's difficult for us to be able to produce a high amount of force. You're going to have a decrease in your force capacity. If you shorten the muscle too much, it's going to have a decrease in the ability to produce force. So if you think about in terms of a bicep curl, for example, and I'm sorry that I keep using this example. It's just an easy example to use. But it's very difficult if you handed me a 20-pound dumbbell, for example, and my arm is fully extended, like at my side, and that's where I'm starting this particular activity. It's really difficult for me to get this action started. Once I get about halfway through the contraction, it becomes easier because that's the optimal overlap of the muscle, and that's where I can produce the largest amount of force. Then as I contract all the way up to a fully flexed position, I again decrease my ability to produce force. And that's because we have too much overlap and there's not much more room for me to continue to contract. So again, just keep in mind that we have an optimal length of muscle contractions, and that optimal length can vary from joint to joint. In terms of phases of muscle contraction, we have a stimulus, and again, that stimulus is going to come from our motor neuron. And then we have a latent period, and this is kind of the period in which it takes for the muscle cell to accept that particular stimulus from the motor neuron and get all the things ready to go in order for contraction to occur. And that's, kind of hopefully a very short period, particularly for some of those fast twitch fibers. So with our fast twitch fibers, we want our latent period to be very, very, very small. And again, the more elite of a power athlete you are, the smaller you hope this latent period is. The quicker you hope that you can react from a particular stimuli. The quicker, you hear the gun go off, the quicker you can get out of your blocks and start running your race. So following the latent period, we have the contraction phase of this muscle contraction, and then also this will be followed by a relaxation phase. Okay. So this just shows you an example of what we just talked about. So again, we start with a stimuli. We have a latent period, which again will be very short for our fast twitch fibers, will be a little bit longer for our slow twitch fibers. Then we have that period of contraction and followed by a period of relaxation where we return back to our resting state. Okay, angle of pull. So this is the angle between the line of pull of the muscle and the bone to which it inserts. This is going to angle towards the joint. With movement, the angle of pull changes, generally going to decrease. We generally decrease that joint angle, and the angle of pull is generally less than 50 degrees. Angle of pull is related to our biomechanical advantage or disadvantage in relation to a particular joint and a particular muscle action. Another term that we've kind of already mentioned in lecture 4 are uniarticular muscles and biarticular muscles. Uni means one, so uniarticular muscles cross and act directly only on the joint that they cross, so it crosses one joint. Biarticular muscles are going to cross and act directly on two different joints, and these can really be separated into two separate types of actions now. We can have concurrent movements, so all the muscle maintains a relatively consistent length because the same action occurs at each joint. And we also have countercurrent movements, and this results in substantial shortening of the muscle. So for example, our rectus femoris is a biarticular muscle. So it attaches on your hip and crosses down your femur, down your thigh, and attaches to the patella tendon. So it crosses both the hip joint and the knee joint. The actions of this muscle, also called the kicking muscle, are flexion of the hip and extension of the knee. So if I do both of those actions at the same time, I'm doing a countercurrent movement. So both of the actions are activated at both joints, and this will cause a substantial shortening of this particular muscle. Concurrent movements, I'm going to have one of the joints contract and the other one is going to lengthen. So for example, this could be hip flexion and also knee flexion. So Hip flexion, we have shortening, but at knee flexion, we have extension. So the muscle maintains the relatively consistent length. Could be the opposite as well. We could have knee extension and hip extension at the same time. So now we have shortening at the knee and lengthening at the hip, and this will cause the muscle to maintain a relatively consistent length. So again, here is the rectus femoris, and again, you can see that it's crossing both joints. If we have both actions activated, it's going to cause substantial shortening. So for this example, that would be hip flexion and knee extension. If we have one happening, so hip flexion, and the opposite happening in the other joint, so knee flexion, we're having lengthening at the knee joint and shortening at the hip joint, so therefore the length stays relatively the same.